Hello and welcome. Thank you all for coming today to Divided or United, the psychology behind polarisation and the search for common ground. Now, this event has been put on by the School of Psychology to coincide with Mental Health Month. I'm Ridget Ahmed. I'll be your host this evening. I'm a presenter and senior producer with Guardian Australia's podcast Full Story. We'll get to our panellists in a moment, but first I just want to acknowledge that we gather on Gadigal country where discovery and learning have occurred for millennia, country that has been home to knowledge sharing from generation to generation from times long distant, country that has never been ceded. As we meet today, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the Gadigal people, to the traditional custodians of the country from which you are joining us today, and to the knowledge, learning and nurturing of the earth, water and air that are embedded deeply and forever in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander custodianship of country. As we mark 175 years of the university's history, we acknowledge that this place has been a place of learning and knowledge exchange for over 60,000 years, and that this wisdom has been passed down through many generations. Well, welcome. We're going to cover a lot of ground today. We're going to talk about the growing divisions that we see in our society, in our news, in our politics, in our shared reality, in our online lives and in our real lives. And we'll also just talk about the psychology behind that polarisation, what might feed it, and most importantly, how we overcome it. So let's get to know our panel a little bit. We'll start with Micah Goldwater, who's a professor in the School of Psychology. Micah co-directs the Sydney Seedling Development Psychology Lab and leads the Charles Perkins Centre Research Node on Fighting Truth Decay. Micah, what's your area of expertise?
Yeah, thanks. So I researched the relationships between what people know and how they think, and the slide that's relevant for this topic is when people don't actually really know very much, but still can become very confident in their beliefs and very confident in their knowledge based on sort of certain types of stories being told, certain types of values being appealed to, and how that can lead us with a kind of false sense of understanding and rigidity in how we, see the world.
I'm sure that all sounds very familiar to a lot of us. And Fiona White is the director of the Sydney University Psychology of Intergroup Relations Lab and professor of social psychology at the University of Sydney. Fiona, you're our biases person.
I'm the prejudice, bias, discrimination person, yeah. So a lot of my social psychology research in my lab and my students who are in the back row there spend a lot of their time developing social and cognitive strategies to reduce bias, prejudice and so forth. And some of the strategies we use are intergroup contact, perspective taking, recategorisation. So that's kind of how I'm fitting into this discussion today.
And Francesco Bailo, a lecturer in data analytics in the social sciences at the University of Sydney and deputy director of the Centre for AI, Trust and Governance. You're like our algorithms expert.
Yeah, I'm a political scientist or a social scientist, and I'm interested in understanding what is the impact of digital technologies, including social media, but also more recently including generative AI, on political communication and how we, again, communicate and talk about politics, but also how we experience through the digital technology, how we experience reality out there, the problems out there, and also what we think about other people that, of course, are out there we need to relate with.
Fantastic. Right, we're going to get underway. Before we begin, we are going to show you some polls on the screen. This is very unscientific data collection. I'm sure in your research you do this a lot more formally. There's going to be two questions, one on vaccines, and when we get enough answers, we'll turn over to a question on climate policy. And once we've got your answers, we're going to take a look and we're going to talk about what it tells us. But first, I want to start with, what do we mean in a psychological setting when we talk about polarisation? Fiona.
So the term was originated by Moscovici in the late 60s, so a social psychologist who said that, when moderate kind of opinions and attitudes get into a group discussion, after that discussion, you turn and you leave that discussion with more extreme kind of attitudes. So this idea of group polarisation. And I think since Moscovici's work and over several decades, we kind of now see a more evolved construct of group polarisation with regard to, you know, different groups being divided on different topics that sometimes may be really important to their identity. I think if you have a certain topic that or core attitude that is really important to who you are, there's more likely that you'll adopt a more extreme position than a moderate position on that kind of topic. So I think the topic really permeates the level of group polarisation in society today. So that's kind of a little bit of a history and kind of where we're at today.
Micah, Francesco, do you want to add to any of that?
Sure, yeah, so I think one thing when I'm thinking about what's sort of sometimes the problem with this is that it's not necessarily an issue in any given topic or issue that there's going to be divide in people's opinions and people are going to think different things about all kinds of things, right? What pizza should we order, you know, whatever it is, right? So there's going to be all kinds of topics that, any individual topic you might have differs of attitude, but one of the issues becomes when you start seeing that your attitude on this topic is also determines your attitude on all these other topics, right? If you start sort of having the same sort of, if you could have the same view about kind of everything, that sort of suggests you're kind of just thinking this way because everyone in your social group thinks this way about all these different things, right? Even if they're not necessarily on the surface that related to each other. Because if you were just thinking about the particular data or whatever it was for one given topic, your opinion on one thing may not be so highly correlated with other people as your opinions on all these other things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, maybe simply so polarization, of course, is a very complex and in some sense multidimensional phenomenon. It really depends also what kind of aspect you're interested in. It could be a very damaging thing for democracy and for public conversation. It could be a good thing. Maybe we can talk about this later. So a form of polarization that especially political scientists have been really looking into recently is affective polarization. So the idea, again, it comes to groups, but also the idea of a specific group to deform a bit or think about the other groups are perceived. So the perception across the different groups. So really you have a strong set of feelings so groups are not just defined by ideology in that sense, and opposition is not just about ideology, but you start to build a very strong emotional attachment to your group and of course opposition to the other group.
Okay, we're going to get some clarity now because we have the answers to our poll. Everyone's so fast tonight. Shall we have a little look? Shall we start with our vaccine question? I don't know if you can, so tell us what we're seeing, Francesco. How divided does this audience think Australians are on vaccines and whether they're safe?
Yeah, the question was formulated in a way, so we're not asking the audience, of course, this is probably not the average Australian audience, is well informed, etc. So we're asking the audience to try to think what their co-workers, so the people out there in Australia might think about vaccine safety. We know that this, of course, is a topic that was highly discussed, especially during the pandemic. So we're asking there how many Australians you think that consider vaccine safe, and again, the majority seems to be located between the 60% and the 80%. So maybe I guess we can see the data says about Australians and where they are located.
So what about the real data then?
Yeah. So the real data, so you did quite well. You underestimated the real Australia just by a bit. So you were in the bracket 80%, is actually higher than that. To be noted, of course, that this data was collected after the pandemic. The pandemic negatively affected the perception of vaccine safety. But in general, the survey pointed out that 85% of Australians consider vaccines as safe, and 88% think that they're effective. Again, this is down from before the pandemic, where these numbers were around 90%. So I guess you're not doing that bad. You are kind of on spot, although you are still underestimating a bit how good Australians trust how effective the vaccine.
So this is giving us an idea that on this issue, we're not as polarised as some may think. How did we do on climate policy? Let's take a look. So we were asking what percentage of Australians support climate policy do we think? Micah, what's this telling us?
So I'm going to show you more complicated data than we just had for the vaccines because a paper came out at the end of last year, done by researchers at University of Melbourne and UNSW, on this, particularly on this topic, and particularly around, then also asked people, all right, looking at their political party affiliation or who most likely to vote for, and then what do you think other people in your party would support, and how about what do you think about the other parties?
So what's this telling us? That the audience thinks...
So this is sort of suggesting, so right here, now, unfortunately, the numbers aren't going to entirely map on quite as easily to this graph, but it's sort of seeing like there's a kind of medium to medium-high level of support. You kind of assume most people kind of support it, but not sort of everyone. And maybe that's, potentially accurate, but if you want to go to the next
Let's have a look at the real
slide.
data.
All right, so here now, what's happening here is this is breaking it down by people, what party they are in and what they think about the other parties. All right? So before we go to the real, what they actually support. So basically everyone kind of views pretty extreme things about other people. So people, if you are in the Greens, so the top bunch of data are people who vote for the Greens, and they think that everyone else is way more against action on climate change than they are, right? That's Pauline Hanson's One Nation at the bottom there. So it's Greens, Labour, LNP, and Pauline Hanson One Nation, right? And so you can kind of even see how, if you look at the LNP, they're sort of they're kind of saying we're actually pretty close to the Greens, and the LNP people are thinking they're pretty close to the Greens on their support for climate action, right? The Greens think these are much more extremely different from each other, right? I want to go to the next one. And so at the top is what the people actually endorsed based on what they themselves endorsed, rather than perceptions of others. And so what you see is that it's way less extreme than people's perceptions of each other's. One thing that's interesting is that the Greens are actually less extreme than they think they are, right? So the Greens actually have less climate support than they think the Greens do. And so, but if you look, again, you sort of look at here, right, the LNP actually does are overall more in favor of action than against action, right? Now, so that starts getting into why this might be the case, which, one of the things we were talking about is basically we'll transition to the next thing, but the sort of elites, let's call them, the people in the media and the political leaders might be expressing more extreme views than the actual people who end up voting for those people, right?
So this is a fascinating exercise, and it goes to the group influence you're talking about. But so what are the psychological consequences then of feeling like we're more polarized than we actually are?
Well, I think what was interesting there was there seemed to be a bigger degree of polarisation for climate change than for vaccines, just in this audience, so there was a bit of a movement into the middle there. So that's interesting. So it's just saying, depends on the issue, first of all, right? So polarisation depends on the issue. How much does it mean to us? Do we identify with this issue? Is it important to ourself, our notion of self? So I think that's really going to determine that, and therefore the consequences of it. If we and ah about a particular issue, we don't really have a sense of that identity or that issue, then polarisation is probably not consequential for us. But if we really are climate change activists and we live and breathe it and we protest it every weekend, then polarisations and perceptions of others not supporting us to change climate change policy is going to impact us more.
So this is leads me to something I'm really interested in then, in terms of how we form our views. Francesco, you're probably going to say all through social media now, but what influences what we think? Is it emotions, fears? Is it natural biases that we bring to an issue?
Yeah, of course, if you're studying social media, you think that social media is the cause and the consequence of everything. So everything is related to that. Social media is definitely important, although the media ecosystem and the media diet, of course, is not just social media. So We still rely on traditional news sources, but also we still rely on friends and colleagues. Actually, the strongest vector of influence is, of course, our friends, the people we trust, and that with which we spend most of the time. So social media is problematic. And so social media has been around for now almost 20 years. Sometimes we still refer to it as a new media, but actually it's not. So we know something about social media. And what has been noticed, of course, is that the way that social media selects and presents the content to us is very much biased. And there are very specific dynamics. It's not like a secret, so because social media is run by for-profit companies, most of them, with very limited exceptions, one being Signal, which is a not-for-profit, and is not really a social media, it's more like a messaging app. But most of the social media applications we're using are for-profit, so basically they make money only if we keep engaged with the tool, and if we don't switch to another tool or another platform. So the way to do this, of course, is to constantly select through the algorithms or to a set of algorithms what is the content that gets the most engagement and the most attention from the users. And we know that most of this, when it comes again to political discussions and political items, most of this content, of course, are the content that triggers very strong emotional reactions. A very long post about taxation policy is not going to get a lot of attention. A very complicated memo on how we should run schools is not going to get a lot of attention. If we trigger some emotional reaction by touching on some very hot topic, then we get a lot of content engagement, and then we got a lot of reactions, and then we stick to that because we don't just look at the content, maybe we reply to the content, so we go back to see whether somebody else has replied to our content. And then we start this kind of dynamic, which of course are really profitable for the companies that run them. The companies that don't really care what is the content, they're kind of agnostic. They're not neutral, but they are not agnostic to the content because they just want content that generates attention. And this, of course, is the problem that probably you were referring to, is the kind of logics that push this extreme content to us, which, of course, can have a number of effects on our perception, but also on our politics.
And I guess the other thing is with social media, and we just have to look at all of our accounts, we create these echo chambers for ourselves, right? And we just only get information that is relevant to us. And then that kind of polarizes us a little bit from the other group. So that's another thing that social media does, is that it creates these echo chambers. We become part of our own echo chambers. We become part of the particular value system that is relevant to us. And then we find out less about the other. And then that other becomes more distant. So this is what the echo chamber is achieving, is creating this distance.
So what does it also mean when somebody has a specific worldview and they start to see information that may be different to that worldview or may fit into it? How do we process that?
It depends what the topic is. If it's really, like I said, personally, socially relevant to my identity, and it's a negative kind of view, you probably just flick to the next message. You won't process it. If it's something that's kind of moderately relevant, you might read it and see and try and see it as information. But if you're really identifying in a very extreme sense and it's negative, you might just flick to the next message.
Yeah, there's a kind of short, there's some work showing that there's a kind of short window when people often learning about a new topic and they're kind of open before they sort of formed an opinion. Like I remember early on when people were bringing up nuclear energy again, it's like, oh, we don't need solar, we need nuclear, and I'm being like, oh, nuclear, I haven't thought about that in a while. Mm-hmm. Then I had like a small window to be kind of influenced about it. But sort of the more experience, but then if you go, I'm going to start looking in, then you start getting fed more videos about promoting nuclear energy, or maybe not. You kind of form your opinion kind of quickly, and then it becomes much harder to alter it often.
What does that mean for being in a group? If someone's in a group and they might not hold very strong views, but the group does that make them more extreme?
Yeah, so often in group settings, there's research, so if you have a whole lot of people who aren't very confident in their beliefs, but like one person in the group is super confident in their beliefs, that will spread around the group, right? And so if you have different, so people will go, like, well, that guy's confident, he must know something, and so that sort of spreads, and that's sort of how you get. And then if you have different people with their groups having different overly confident people, then that's going to become the sort of message that the group adopts. Because what else are you going to base it on?
But the problem is when we form groups, we like to form groups of people that are similar to us. It lowers our anxiety, we feel more confident, we feel more comfortable. So that's what we call the in-group, because, we see others that look like us and we feel comfortable. So this is also creating this kind of polarisation, because our in-group has a very shared identity, a very similar identity to us, because they're making us feel less anxious. They might look like us, they might sound like us, and they might play the same sport as us, and that will be our in-group. And that group is giving us a sense of self-esteem. It's social identity theory saying is the group is what gives us all a sense of who we are and how we kind of interact in the world. So the group is ultimately important.
Francesco, you must see this in social media, but I've heard quite often people say, well, ultimately human beings are just tribal, and that's just how we operate.
Yes. So actually, also related to this concept, I think we define our identity much more through politics probably than we used to. So I was thinking about what Micah just said about these kind of issues that go out there and they're not political. And then you have this kind of margin window of opportunity to get an opinion without being influenced by your ideology or alignment within your group. And I think that this is true, but this kind of issues that are not political are not that many. So there is this interesting concept that has been floating around about hyperpolitics. So we are moving into a situation where we're not really, so our political identity is not very strong or defined by a strong ideology as used to be in the past. But then also, we are still attaching to a lot of items that immediately become politically charged. So I'm thinking about all the cultural items, movies, music, sports, and that in the past were definitely areas where there was no point of talking about polarization there. But now, because of this dynamic of like hyperpolitization, where everything becomes political, because everything has to be in line with the group you're being part of, also from a political perspective, and these spaces where they're not political in that sense, or where the polarization doesn't really make sense, are kind of, this is the idea, kind of shrinking. So we don't have that many spaces where we actually don't have our political alignment that is really defining very strongly what we should consider.
There's not a lot of spaces for consensus? Is that what you mean?
I'm thinking about like Taylor Swift, for example. Think about a pop icon and how politically charged has been recently. So music, sports, the American football, and the politically charged situation there, about books, about movies, how strongly politically charged they are. And I think this is also comes back to the idea of polarization that, and in some sense, again, of course, I always have to go back to social media. Social media is pushing this kind of polarization because also let's remember how we define our profiles on social media. I think our profiles are defined through what we like, and of course, we need to have a very constructed kind of idea of what we like.
Social media is designed to make us think, to put forward an identity. Yeah. I think this is a good moment to say, because we're talking about polarization in a negative connotation. There's some good things about polarization. Sometimes it can herald social progress.
Yeah. So I think polarization, when there is a division, then there's both sides wanting to make a change. There's a motivation for it. Because if we were all homogenous and we're just like this, we're all the same, there wouldn't be this motivation to change anything because we wouldn't know what to change because everything's the same. So by having division and diversity, and this is why diversity is really good within groups, is to get this exchange of ideas. Have a different opinion, consider that different opinion. Is that opinion valid? Do we agree with that opinion? Is that effective for social change? So in those instances, there are positive elements to polarisation. So I think maybe there has been this negative connotation, but again, it's got to be kind of polarisation with a degree of sanity. You know what I mean? Not too extreme, but some difference. I think difference and polarisation are probably two different constructs, and diversity is probably also a different, more positive construct than polarisation, but both of them have a difference of opinion, and I think that's good for change. Otherwise, change won't happen if we all think the same, because that's groupthink, and when we're all in a groupthink cycle, none of us want to change anything.
So there's sort of a sweet spot there. Micah, did you want to say something?
I think it was more before, but I guess...
Yes, yeah.
Oh, yeah,
That's
but...
fine.
Right, so what are the... we were talking about... Of course, I was trying to also remind us the point of some of the data was that, we're not as polarized as we think we are, right? That was sort of one of those points, right? So we were talking about how we're very tribal and how we are going to have identities define our beliefs, but also, and that's true, because there was, if you looked at the graph of the climate policy, there were differences between the political party, people supporting different political parties. There certainly were real differences, but they were just smaller than people think they are, right? So I think, so there's more common, so on the one hand, we kind of view each other as very different from each other, but we also have more common ground than we might sort of think, right? And so I think there might be more of a chance to have this good level of disagreement than you're saying, right? This sort of positive level of disagreement, but people are, lots of the sort of attention grabbers, engagement getters on media often are characterizing the other group as much more different from you than they are.
So you've got us to a good spot. So who's to blame? Because the data has shown us.
You said I'm not allowed to slander anyone.
Yeah, we're not as polarized as we think we are. So why does it feel that way? Is traditional media to blame? I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, it comes back, I guess, to social media, echo chambers, and being comfortable in the groups that we belong to, rather than putting ourselves out there and maybe interacting with a group that has been in a kind of disagreeing of opinion relationship with that group. We tend to avoid that group because we don't like that, we don't feel comfortable. So there is this kind of instinct, just within us to stay within our group, to bond within our group and to attach within our group. And that's a really strong evolutionary drive.
Keeps us alive.
To protect our group, yeah. And I think that could be very much the basis of what's going on in polarisation.
Do we feel cognitive pain, mental pain, when we hear a view that we just viscerally disagree with?
If that issue is really important to us, yes. And again, it comes down to the issue with regard to polarisation. I wouldn't say anyone here is completely polarised on every issue. I think there are going to be different issues here in this room that resonate with people more than others, and that might be the polarising issue. And the motivating one for change.
So is it, we've already talked about social media being a little bit to blame, Francesco. What about misinformation? A lot of the stuff out there that's just wrong.
Yeah. Well, if I can answer to the question, so definitely also misinformation is going to be part of this, but I think we are also in part to blame. So I think we feel exhausted. The degree of the flow of information is exhausting. So in some sense, polarization is also a sort of way to simplify how things actually are, our complexity actually is. So again, the construction of our group. Again, polarization is mostly about also perception of the others. So perceiving the others as worse or more kind of flat than they actually are is much easier. So because we are exhausted in dealing with all the complexity, the poly crises that are thrown at us at different levels. So just go through, open a newspaper and see what is happening again.
Yeah.
COVID recently, but then of course climate change and then conflicts. and then any kind of dimension from the micro to the macro dimension. So we are also polarized because we probably don't have the sufficient strength to actually get the right information about facts, and we come to misinformation and the other part. So reaching out is really, really difficult. It's something you need to put a lot of effort in. So misinformation is also something that definitely is pushed by political elites, the leadership. Social media, of course, they generate a lot of traffic out of that because misinformation is really effective, it's catchy, is again a simplification. The pandemic, something happened, you have a perfect story, a perfect conspiracy theory that explains everything in a post or maybe in a 5-second video, so it's catchy. And we are, in some sense, responsible also for pushing that forward. If I can bring a personal example of once when I actually found myself to be part of this or share misinformation. I don't know if you remember the story during the bushfire, because in Australia we were lucky, of course, to have the back-to-back crisis from the bushfire to the COVID. But during the bushfire 19 and 20, so there was this nice story about a wombat that basically brought some family to safety. And there was a push about on Facebook, and the point was this wombat is actually showing more sense of protecting the community than the government. That was the whole point, right? Of course, if you think about, doesn't make any sense, but it's a nice story, right? You think about, yes, this animal is wild animal is actually thinking about and taking care of the community more than the government, and then you reshare because it's not that you really think that, but you think it is a nice story and feed what you want to communicate because you're angry at the government that is not doing enough for the bushfire. So we are responsible for most of the time for sharing and resharing this information because we don't really stop to think about what the effect is going to be. But the point is that most of the time this information is actually going to characterize society and the division in a very simplistic way, expanding the gap that divides us and the other part.
Yeah, because remember, we're the agents. We're the ones pressing that button.
Yeah.
I mean, it's there. We're deciding what we're flicking through and what we're not, and what we're reading.
But it's. I mean, you've all described how we like groups. We like the groups that reflect us and our identity and views that we already have. It sounds like social media and traditional media are kind of set up to exploit that.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, yes, entirely. And we've got to stop blaming ourselves and blame the others again.
Let's blame everyone.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. I mean, because the sort of leaders of groups may have much more extreme views to each other. If you look at the leaders of different groups, their views, or at least their rhetoric, will be very, very different, which is one of the things that leads us to thinking that we're more polarized than we are.
So it makes a difference
we're taking,
if someone's in power.
The cues. Yeah.
It makes a difference if someone's in power and in authority.
Yeah. I mean, it could be an official leader like the president or something, but it also could just be like a popular person. It could be, an influencer, as we say, right? I mean, the reason why they're called influencers is because they're influencing people in some way, right? Presumably. And so it doesn't have to be like, so it could be a kind of new form of, but it's sort of a social power, right? There's a sort of social power and influence that people have that will, and then if you compare them, right? So if this false polarization is you go, well, if you sort of support this person, your views must be as extreme as this person's views are, even if that doesn't seem to be the case. So, but it's certainly that but their goal is to, as you're saying with the engagement, like their goal is to drive division often. The people in these leadership positions are often trying to do that.
And it's lucrative.
Yeah. Right. Again, right. If you're just kind of talking about boring tax policy or something, like you said, then you're not making a lot of money, reporting on that. I mean, obviously, The Guardian would only report truthful and amazing things that everyone should read.
All of our
Yeah. But all these other media companies.
It's everyone else. We're going to get into the solutions very shortly, but it's Mental Health Month. What are the consequences of us feeling this way, feeling like everybody else is more extreme than us?
It can be visceral depending, again, on that issue and whether it's part of your identity. We know politically on religious issues at the moment there's a lot of intergroup tensions that are emanating not just here but from that are global tensions. So if you are part of one of these religious or cultural groups, it's highly anxiety provoking, no matter what end of the spectrum you're on. So it's very debilitating. I mean, some people can't get up and go to work. It's that debilitating because this conflict is impacting them at every level of their life. So we need to really be mindful of that, particularly for us as educators, in teaching our students this content. We really need to be mindful of bringing things together, particularly during this week, this mental health week, because if you are a member of these groups that are suffering at the moment, it's very challenging and it's very difficult.
I mean, to flip it the other way, often when people end up sort of going down, say, the conspiracy rabbit hole or something like that, it's often a result of some extremely stressful or isolating thing that happened. So people might, there was the story of the person in Queensland who shot those cops, or he was someone who was, I don't remember the whole story, but he was a sort of educator in New South Wales. His sort of career was going well. Then he lost his job. He got really sick, and all these things sort of happened at once. And he kind of suddenly was like separated from this whole life he thought that he had. His identity was sort of broken by these experiences, and then he became very vulnerable to sort of becoming involved in these like conspiracy groups and leading to this extremism. So it goes sort of. What are the reasons why you want to keep people connected, right? So we often might have if someone has a very different opinion than us about some important issue, we might want to you might want to reject those people, right? You don't want to spend time with people who believe things that you might find abhorrent, but it's not necessarily, and you can make that decision if you can't tolerate it, but it's not gonna make that person less. They're not going to like.
It's not going to change their mind.
They're not going to be like, well, now I'm going to change my mind now that all my friends abandoned me, right? That's not going to be the thing that changes their mind, right? They're going to go into the other group. They're going to go even deeper to the other group because the other group is going to welcome them with open arms, right?
Let's talk about the solutions because you've led us very nicely to that, Francesco. I don't know if you're going to tell us we'll just turn off our phones. This is what's going to fix it all.
That's a good solution.
But can social media be part of the solution?
Yes. So it's difficult to imagine a solution that does not include us communicating through social media. But definitely we want to be, so social media brings digital technologies because of course social media, but now we also have generative AI that are going to be integrated in social media. There is kind of clear, weird mesh now between generative AI and social media. So it's broader. It's not just social media. It's TikTok, for example, is social media. There is not a lot of social component there. But this kind of digital technology bubble that is really much personal is going to be part of the solution. It's going to be part of the diet no matter what. So the kind of way we communicate with the others. So what is important, of course, is for us to use this technology more critically. And have a better understanding of how we actually drive the technology instead of being driven by the technology. Because
what does that mean? Does that mean seeking out information, seeking out facts or views that we might not agree with?
Well, there are different ways to control this. So screen time, very simple. So when you start realizing that you spend 2 hours on Instagram or on TikTok, well, that's probably it's a very good indicator that you switched the brain and something else was driving. But also, yes, diversifying. So be more proactive in looking for information instead of just receiving passively these feeds of information that is mostly like very short kind of bits of content, mostly video actually, very little text, mostly video was very flashy, very so we need to be...
So text is better for your mental health?
Yes, oh yeah, definitely, because long form pieces of text are just the way that allow you to be much more critical by definition because you don't, you activate the deep thinking and also allow you to get into the complexity of so we talk about polarization, political problems. There is no way you can grasp climate change policy and solutions without reading something like newspaper articles, for example. You cannot substitute that with a a 5 seconds video on TikTok. There is no way that is going to give you the complexity of the issue. It can be potentially very useful to activate you into doing something, okay, on one side or the other. And that's possibly also good, but can be the first step. But then you want to be in charge and find the information that is actually providing you a more deeper knowledge, but also a broader perspective or point of views that are really difficult to find on social media, especially the depth of we see a lot of the otherness of social media because we don't lie, of course, we are always angry, so if, by definition, we need to find somebody we need to oppose, but we never kind of personalize, we never really give depth to that other experience. We don't really see that. So that's also, reaching out is going to be very important. We need to use social media, but we need to use them better to do this.
Well, I think we need two solutions. We need the bottom up, so that's the researchers in this field of intergroup relations, promoting ideas like social psychology, which is interactions such as intergroup contact, creating a common goal, being able to achieve that goal, not alone but together, so this notion of togetherness, of achievement. But also, cooperation rather than competitiveness. So these are kind of strategies that I use in the lab. So these are kind of individual bottom-up strategies, but then we need the top-down as well. We need the systemic kind of interventions from government, from social media, from media just generally, impacting, improving the social cohesion of society. So I don't think, my lab-based, individual-based interventions are going to be sufficient because they're more individualistic. I think you also need systemic kind of top-down government interventions, policy interventions. I mean, we've got media use policy coming out, so we'll just see how effective that is. It's, again, a polarising issue. It's controversial, but it's a step that no other government has taken internationally.
If we experience a form of mental pain when we're talking to someone that we vehemently disagree with, how are we supposed to overcome that if we want to be less polarised and reach consensus?
It's extremely difficult. This is actually some of the reasons why there's some research showing how much better ChatGPT is actually at convincing people to not believe in conspiracies than other humans are, because it stays very calm.
The AI is the solution? Is that what you're telling us?
It's overall going to probably spread more misinformation than stop, but researchers have created some targeted AI bots that you can go and just, it's not like debunkbot.com. You just go and go I believe George Bush did 9/11 or something. You say that to it, and then it could go through and really talk you very calmly about it, right? If you say that at Christmas dinner, someone's you're not gonna sit there and be super calm and understanding, yes, I see how you came to that point of view, I understand, but here's how you should think about it differently, so it has all this sort of knowledge, it has lots of knowledge because it was trained on the entire internet, right? And it also can tailor it very specifically to whatever idiosyncratic views that anyone has in a very calm way. So we can actually potentially, if we want to be persuaders of people, we can actually take a cue from this. But then it's a lot of work. You have to suppress your own emotional reaction. You can't, if you have to suppress your own feelings about it and be kind of like a therapist, basically,
I have to.
It depends who it is. Who's the person disagreeing with you? Is it your partner or is it some distant stranger? And are you willing to have that debate or not have that debate at Christmas or Christmas lunch? It just depends on the context. Being a typical social psychologist, we're not going to make these general proclamations depending on who that person is and the context. But Christmas lunch can be challenging because it's a time when we are with family and sometimes choice isn't the issue, it's Christmas and you all have to get together. So it's what Micah said, do we just inhibit because it's a better and easier lunch to have, or do we actually say something? And are we more likely to say something to a stranger?
Are we? What's the answer to that? Should we engage, and are we more likely to when we don't know the person?
Yeah. We're probably more likely to engage, but we probably shouldn't, depending on what the topic is again. What are we going to achieve from it? I think that's the bigger question. Sometimes it's a much bigger person to say, oh, well, that's an interesting opinion. It's slightly different to mine, and then walk away, you know. Or you can ask, why do you think that? Then that's going to engender a more of a discussion. So it depends, do you want a discussion or not?
But is there a responsibility to understand the emotion behind an extreme view? And I'll give you an example. We saw some big rallies here. Members of the far right attended, but when you listen to why some people attended, they said, oh, it's migration, and then they raised housing as an issue. Now, research suggests, research has shown migration isn't the reason why our house prices are through the roof. So how do we engage with that underlying feeling that people have that they've then attached to a very polarised view?
How do you engage with the far right? Asking how do you engage with the far right? Yeah.
Right.
No, just, you know,
Right. So
should we try and understand where people are coming from?
I mean, I actually don't have, I've been studying the COVID-19 pandemic and the response and the protests from the far right was embraced it, but of course it was not just the far right. You could see specifically who was participating in these protests, and of course were not the kind of professional that could work from home. They were the kind of people that had to go out, and if the working side was closed, they were out without a job. So of course you can immediately see why polarization on both sides might create a distortion and a very strong simplification. So it's very much easy to label far-right protests as racist, so because if you do that, then you don't need to deal with them. But then, of course, I don't know, you asked the question before, what is good for us? So at the individual level, probably I don't know what's the answer, so maybe sometimes disengagement is good. At the political level, so the collective level, is never good. So you always have, so disengaging, which is a clear and very strong consequence of polarization, because when you have a very polarized debate, people, the average person, disengage, because you don't want to, you have a complicated life, you don't have a lot of time, you don't want even to spend some of this time in this kind of crazy conversation. But then, of course, when you disengage, then you left the stage to the most extreme people that will be the ones left standing, fighting for that specific issue. So disengagement is not the right way to do it, although on a personal level, on a psychological level, again, I'm not an expert, could be good sometimes to disengage, but on a political level is not the answer. It's going to just create a ground, open up grounds and priorities to the people that are actually benefiting politically from this kind of strong perception of polarization.
And sometimes when you have these discussions, let's use the example of a discussion with someone from the far right, there can be this construct called backlash. So what you do is you just harden their opinions anyway by what you're saying. So you're not really achieving what you wanted to achieve in that conversation.
I mean, looking at the particular issue around something like housing and migration, things like that. So on the one hand, right, you could just say debunk that particular connection, right? The studies show this isn't really about that, right? Now that has temporary, the researchers show that's a sort of temporary fix, because if you go right back into the same media stream that you had before, you'll kind of forget the debunking ever happened. So that's sort of one thing, because you go back, you might listen to that, and then you go back to one of these other news companies, that's not yours, might start telling them, they might reinforce the original misinformation, right? But in addition, the crisis is still there. Right, so if if we're talking about top-down intervention, solving the housing crisis would be much more effective than like me as a psychologist designing a debunking intervention. But like, actually, it's not the migrants, right? Well, they still don't have housing, right? So so there's only there's only so
dealing
much
with the core issue.
But so that underlying. So it's important to understand these underlying causes, and then try to address them, not necessarily just from a persuasive aspect, but an actual material aspect.
We're going to put up a slide so that people can start submitting their questions to put to the panelists. But while we're just collecting those questions, if someone at Christmas lunch does have a view that you don't agree with, what's the likelihood of changing someone's mind?
Well, how many wines deep are we at this
Does
point?
it depend how extreme their view is in terms of whether you can engage?
Yeah, and it depends on how informed their view is as to the level of my engagement. You know, if it's not a particularly informed view, you can be very gentle and say, look, there's some research out there that shows this, and they can take that on board or they can leave it, you know. So again, it's Christmas. So, I mean, harmony is really important for me, and promoting harmony in some way, shape or form. And it's kind of nice to say, well, you know, I can see why you might think that, but, you know, the research actually shows this. But sometimes they don't really want to listen to a professor at
Facts
Christmas.
don't always work.
And, you know, that's my, you know, know-it-all professor friends. So, you know, you get targeted that way as well. So you've got to be kind of mindful of your situation at Christmas, what you want to achieve at Christmas. And it is really about lunch and harmony. I think the more important thing is how I can change attitudes outside of my family and outside of Christmas in the everyday space. I think that's my challenge as a researcher.
Well, I mean, I think if you're thinking about this as members of the audience or something like that, you know, part of it has to do with the level of trust the person has, right? Is the person bringing this up at Christmas lunch because he's like, oh, this liberal, I'll get his, you know, I'm gonna piss off, I'm gonna trigger this lib or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, if that's like their goal and they kind of don't view you as a trustworthy source of information, there's not like that much you can do. But if someone is just sort of like, oh, I've been reading that, you know, well, if someone is just kind of reporting on something they sort of are misinformed about, that's different. Because, I mean, so there's this guy who wrote, Lee McIntyre, wrote this book on how to talk to a science denier. He went to like flat earther conferences and all these types of things. And he sort of talked a lot about how
Flat Earth, you said?
flat Earth conferences, and, you know, and he was sort of trying to be like, what's behind all these beliefs? How can you persuade these people? And a lot of it, what he's sort of saying is after you establish trust with the person, they will become very open to new information. You just have to kind of have some sort of way to establish trust. And so if a family member is picking a fight with you, they probably aren't they're probably not that into your view, right? But if you have a way of establishing trust, then, because the people at flat Earth conferences don't think they think they're following the evidence, right? It's not like they're there, right? They're like, no, like if you look at the science really, right? You know, this isn't a religious belief to them, right? Anyway, yeah, sorry.
I was just wondering, Fiona, just on that, by avoiding that conflict, do you maintain that sort of connection with someone?
Connection with your sibling.
With your sibling, and eventually...
2 hours into Christmas will raise the same issue, yeah. So, you know, we know our family, and we know who we can change in our family and who we just let be. Like I said, I think it's more important as a wider society, we learn who and how we can influence others there. So Christmas is an interesting microcosm. Yes.
Yeah, but I guess coming back to where we started, it sounds like when we talk about polarization, most people do sit in the middle amongst consensus, reasonable views. Would that be fair, Francesco?
Yes.
Just to end.
I think this is clearly also what emerged from the polls we showed before. So the perception that is communicated through the media of what is out there is much more extreme than what actually is. So 85%, 88% of Australians agree that vaccines are safe. Is definitely not a polarized topic. Although when we talk about vaccines, if you talk about vaccines online, then you will get a very different perception. Right. So if I can come back very just quick, link into this, the question, how you behave at Christmas. So I think there is only one very solid rule that we learned over the 20 years of using social media. Don't feed the troll. So, and this also goes back to what Micah said. So it's really important to understand, and what Fiona said, it's really important to understand whether the conversation is about trust building or instead is kind of somebody trolling you. You want to isolate the
What
troll.
is genuine engagement?
You want to identify quickly the troll. That can be your uncle or it can be somebody on the table. We all have trolls. If it's just about getting kind of like, extreme reaction. If you notice that somebody has mentioned Hitler in the first 5 minutes, that's a good signal that somebody's trolling you, so you disengage. But then, of course, we need to reach out. So and reaching out is a complicated thing to do, and building trust is the one thing that allows us to go on and meet up again next Christmas. So, because then if we don't trust, and of course, also when it comes to social life and political life, it's the essential component. So we need to have systems that we think are functional. If we don't trust the system, democracy in our case, to function by bridging through this kind of polarized differences, then we disengage, but also other worse things can happen. We start embracing leaders that tells us that democracy does not work and we should try something different, because there is no other way to bridge the gaps that picture in society.
That's such a great place to pause before we take questions, understanding, building that trust and understanding the intention behind what the person is that we're engaging with. Shall we take some questions? I'm getting some here. They're incredible, they're really complex. We probably won't get to all of them. They're pretty amazing. So shall we start with one of them? Linking into some of the things we just talked about, I'm just reading it out, there's been a great discussion about the far right and potentially hardening polarized beliefs when challenging debunking them. Would the research suggest that those same solutions apply to the far left?
Well, the far left is right about everything. I'm just kidding, sorry. So depending on the topic, but it's actually, so for example, in the area of vaccines, everyone has an intuition that there's lots of far left, like hippies who are anti-vax, but if you look at the data, it's actually much harder to find. Even though overall in Australia, people are very pro-vax, but it's in that particular topic, it is actually very even hard to find a tangible number of left-wing people who are actually anti-vax. I mean, so despite it sort of seeming that way. But right, so I guess, yeah, I mean, in theory, from a psychological perspective, if you're very extreme in your view, and it's very connected to your identity, then it doesn't then the response would, from a psychological perspective, that would be the same regardless of the particular political side that extreme thing sort of is. But I guess, yeah, so often, so from that perspective, it would be the same, but from most of the topics that we're sort of researchers as being concerned with, they do tend to be sort of, right-wing people as the people we want to persuade, like things around climate change and these other types of things, but.
Yeah, and I'd ask that questioner, well, what are the consequences if you're a far-right thinker for society, and what are the consequences if you're a far-left thinker for society? Which are some more positive than others?
That'd be one way to put it.
Consequences is very important for thinking.
So could I just add something to that question?
Of course, yes.
So I think at an individual level, I'm not sure. At the broader level, definitely there is an asymmetry between the far right ecosystem and news media ecosystem and the far left ecosystem. That they tend to be quite symmetric, and also the distance between the far right news outlets and institutions that should create knowledge. I'm thinking about the World Health Organization, for example, or thinking about universities. So they tend to be much more distrustful towards that institution. So in some sense, if you think about debunking as like you have some truth out there and you just want to provide the truth before somebody starts thinking about making some idea or their own opinion. So you need to consider this, that the far right ecosystem will distrust institutions that the far left will not. So from this perspective, definitely, probably the strategy you want to apply should be different. Then whether at the individual level we act differently, that I don't know, but definitely the ecosystem that is pushing this news and these contents around is very much different.
Should we take another question? I feel like you all should be up here hosting. These are fantastic questions. All right. What is the impact of national cultural differences? Are Australians more immune to being influenced by extreme views than Americans?
Well, yeah,
Are we brilliant?
well, right. No, one thing that was interesting was early on in COVID, there was these polls on how sort of pro or anti-lockdown, this pre-vaccine days, like really early days, how pro or anti-lockdown you are and how much those attitudes were connected to your political affiliation. And America was by far the most politicized in their support. Australia was actually second compared to lots of other countries, but Australia being second was still closer to like the 10th most than America was being first. The gap between America and Australia was very large. But I think what more importantly in a way is that the democracy here is, as a citizen of both countries, I have to say that the democracy here is much stronger. Things like ranked choice voting, mandatory voting, there are all these things that prevent some of the things that are happening in America from, it doesn't take, as we're learning, all democratic institutions are more fragile than we might want them to be. But we seem to be in a better position from a structural standpoint, not right.
And I think if you look at the voting profile of America from the last election compared to the voting profile here in Australia, it was much, much closer in America, suggesting greater polarisation than we have here for who we elected to government. So that was an interesting thing. But, there are still, I would say, as a social psychologist, lots of room for improvement.
Yeah.
You never want to just compare yourself to America, because then you can make like anything sound pretty good.
Yeah.
So you don't want to have them as a standard.
Micah can say that because American. I think we just need to be mindful every day of where we are as a society in Australia, how we can protect it from more extreme kind of levels of polarisation that we see in other countries. I think that's really important for us to work toward that as much as we can, not just in our families, but in our workplaces and amongst our friends and our bigger, wider networks, is just to keep things in check all the time. I think it's just be mindful, not to relax is what I'm saying, because it can get out of hand very quickly.
And Francesco, I wonder how much of what you see as you study what's happening on social media is coming from the US. Like, how much is that infiltrating our conversation?
Well, there is a very strong overlap. So in that sense, we're not more protected. We are even less, in some sense, less protected because, of course, the Australian government has much less leverage on the big corporations that are running the business than the US government. So Mark Zuckerberg is definitely not afraid of the Australian Prime Minister, what they can do. We've seen this recently with the media code. But that definitely is afraid of what the US Congress or the US presidents might decide to do with them. So in that sense, we are less afraid. But then also, I think we are similar in the sense that the most violent outburst out of this, because of course the average person is not that polarized. Polarized people, of course, might not necessarily be violent. Most of them are not violent. But then you have a few examples, of course. We had both in Australia and the US. And these, of course, if you look at that biography in some sense, of course, social media and the digital technologies, video games, that kind of online communities seems to have played a big role. But in some sense, what also played a big role is that they were socially isolated, and the only connection, meaningful connection they had with the reality was through the internet. So yeah, probably that kind of threats can be common across the two countries.
This next question links a little bit to what you've just said. The question is, society seems to be getting much more polarized at the same time as inequality is increasing. Is this a coincidence or a symptom?
Symptom.
Yeah.
Definitely a symptom.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, like we were sort of saying around things like the housing crisis, people, these bigger economic inequalities you can sort of see research with more uncertainty, more inequality leads to greater conspiracy theory endorsement. There are these types of research sort of showing those connections. When people's sort of status and when their station in life is much less secure, they have all kinds of negative effects on and changes their beliefs, that's when you scapegoat people and all these types, sort of classically fascism rises in places with these big economic downturns and things like that, right?
Yeah, I mean,
And it's a vicious cycle, right? When you haven't got income coming in, how do you break that cycle? And then if you are having a lot of income coming in, you can invest that money and then you just get richer. So the way the system is set up is to probably increase inequality still, financially that is. Social inequality, another issue, different dimension.
Well, another question was, how is class taken into consideration when measuring polarisation?
Any individual study can certainly sort of do that, right? I mean, it kind of is almost like a sort of research by research type situation in that sense, right? Often people have these, for example, in the US, there was lots of analysis about how education divides became this much bigger divide. Like in pre sort of Trump era, one of the biggest divides between people voting was an education level. I can't remember the exact data, but then it sort of became much bigger, particularly among white people. Particularly among white people, education level became very predictive. Among non-white people, it wasn't as strong, if I remember these data correctly. But it's certainly the case where these types of social class issues, particularly around poor people, so you can break it, you can carve up the data in lots of ways, where you can have education level, income level, race, and then you can sort of isolate the particular effects. And there's certainly lots of social science research doing that type of thing. But you're right, it is very important. It does affect, when you're talking about trust, right? When you have marginalized communities that have a history of the government not treating them very well, and then you tell them, take this government mandated vaccine, you have to, very understandably, they might not have that sense of trust, right? So that's certainly the case there when you're looking at those types of things. You have to try to address some of those issues as well. So, but certainly there's lots of research that looks at this.
There's class polarisation, but it's probably happening at a subtle level. Whereas, the political, the religious polarisation, that's what media talks about all the time. It's more blatant. It's in our face, so we see it. But if you just think about the class and how maybe New South Wales is even organised and the different postcodes and how they're quite segregated, and that segregation creates that polarisation. It's there at a very subtle level. So it's there, but it's not the ones that we talk about or we hear about in the media. It's definitely there, though.
So a lot of the questions are coming in about engagement, and this one is, isn't it important to engage in those conversations for the point of social progress? So going back to talking to people we disagree with. People who are extreme in their views, the question goes on, and cause harm to minority groups should be challenged. How do we balance social progress with social harmony?
I think it's more than just a conversation. And it's more than a conversation at dinner or at Christmas. A lot of the research that I do, it has to be ongoing. It has to be long term. It has to be building a relationship with this person. It has to be achieving something together. It's got to be so much more than just a conversation. It's much more long term. So that's why just having a conversation, I think we need to judge just responding to someone very briefly, is that sufficient? Or is that going to create what I want? Or do I need this ongoing conversation like, well, maybe we should go for coffee. Maybe we can chat about that later and then have another kind of conversation.
Build the trust.
Build it. It's a long-term thing at the extremes. If we're all moderates, not so much, but if we're at the extreme, that's long-term to bring everybody together.
So that goes to this next question. What are your views on deplatforming extreme voices as a means to minimise polarisation?
I
These
think
are hard.
it's a very bad idea. It's has never really worked. I mean, if you can think of an example of when the platformization actually worked, you're not. So first of all, one possible consequence is actually you are exacerbating polarization, because the person that is you're deplatforming, or the community with, for example, one example of that would be the far right in the US. There was the platform across the board from Facebook, YouTube, Twitter before the acquisition by Elon Musk. What they did was they went out, they got Mastodon, which is an open source software to create your own social media app. They set it up, and now they are on Gab. And that means they are totally separated from everybody else. And then, of course, if you have this polarizing dynamic where you have an echo chamber and you only have your own perspective, you can actually increase the degree of extremism that you have within this community. The same thing goes with the one I started with, the anti-vax community. You don't polarize, you don't deplatform that, because what is going to happen is simply that they're going to go out there, they're going to be more difficult to intercept, their fears are going to be more difficult to understand because they're, and so what you want to do instead is definitely you don't want to provide them with an audience, so necessarily you don't want to give them the possible, the largest audience possible, but then separating them from the community or from the public sphere is not gonna solve any issue. It's just gonna push them towards their own little public where they can just like do whatever.
I'm interested in what you think about, because some people have talked about this, and this is more your field, around sort of algorithmic transparency, which would allow for regulation, right? Because TikTok doesn't want to tell anyone what their algorithm is, right? But if you actually had to, then you could say, well, you can't promote the person with the most extreme, you could sort of prevent the algorithm from promoting, right? These people with very extreme views aren't just given a fair shot, they're being amplified. Yeah. And so then the deep platforming is like removing them entirely, rather than having, imagine if your Instagram feed was just the timeline of your friends with nothing else. Yeah. Wouldn't that be great, So, if you're not with all the other crap that's being, forced in there, right? So there's ways of changing how the platform works that wouldn't highlight the most extreme views. That's different than removing people.
And silencing has never worked historically. No. It's just made people angrier. It's made them more extreme. And so I don't think that's the strategy.
That doesn't mean you have to invite extreme people to give talks on campuses,
no,
right? There's this thing in America.
You don't provide them the audience that they could afford through this platform. But at the same time, and also if you deplatform them, you basically strengthen their idea that the system should not be trusted. It's not fair, is rigged. And then of course, if you don't trust the conversation to be fair, then bad things can happen.
It reinforces that view.
Yes, it reinforces a very specific idea, very specific political projects that is sometimes not compatible with democratic institutions.
So there's a theme here which is essentially emerging, which is what Fiona's talking about. It's creating that sort of space that allows an ongoing conversation rather than sort of a one-off where we can just solve all the problems. I want to stay on AI a little bit. This is a fascinating question because this is becoming more and more of a conversation. So this question goes, as a parent, I see my son and his friends often turn to AI tools like ChatGPT and Gemini for answers and get deeply influenced by what they see on social media. From a psychological point of view, how can families and young people find balance and common understanding in this new digital world?
$1 million question.
Well, there's it's not necessary. Those sorts of information aren't necessarily wrong about things. If there's ways for you as a parent, to engage with your kid around what are the things that they're learning from it, and then talking to them openly about that is potentially a good thing to do. But people are also always there's lots of research on how much attitudes are shaped by like TV shows and all kind. This isn't necessarily new, right? Right? Famous example of like the show Jaws. No one's really scared of sharks. The movie. No one's really scared of sharks before Jaws, and then like tens of thousands of sharks have been killed because of the movie, right? Steven Spielberg actually feels really bad that he's led to this like huge population crisis of like sharks, because people are like, we got to go kill the sharks, right? So that wasn't what the movie was like trying to tell anyone, right? So so we get all kinds of influences of our beliefs from media. This is
unintended consequences.
Yeah, all kinds of unintended consequences, and it doesn't. And ChatGPT isn't like uniquely necessarily going to be influencing teenagers more than other things, though. It has some. It's going to keep you much more engaged, right? So it's designed to try to get you to talk to it for all day. It wants you to just keep on talking to it, right? And so in that sense, it's sort of more dangerous because you might just sort of take all of your attention. But the basic principle of talking to your kids about the information they're getting and talking to them about their beliefs and all is sort of the same, I guess.
Yeah, and I think at a practical level, a lot of the research on the impact of like TV violence on kids and now violent video games on children is monitoring. I know that sounds boring, but parental monitoring of content. But also, you know, with ChatGPT, maybe you can have that conversation, you know, what prompt would you put in if you wanted to know that answer? No, that's not a good prompt. Why don't you improve your prompt and you'll get a better answer? So that could be educative. Here's the educator in me saying, you know, use that time to maybe talk about them rather than saying, no, it's a no-go zone. It actually is something now that University of Sydney's, you know, encouraging even in submission of assignments. So it's not something that we're not, well, it is.
No, I know.
So, you know, and so we need to actually probably, even though we're resistant initially, and I was as an educator, maybe just kind of embrace it, but embrace it within how it can be made useful. And as a parent, maybe think about prompts and the prompts you're putting in and refining them and talking to your child about that and saying, see, that prompt didn't give you the right answer, or it gave you a general answer. You needed to refine it. And that's clever.
Francesco, do you have a view, because this technology is going to become ubiquitous?
Yes. So again, the problem I don't think is the technology. The problem is the product. So this is what, going back to the point that we should be much more critical in how we approach this. We're not using technologies. We're using technology that is packaged within a product that is sold to us. And this is the same thing with generative AI, so chatbots, etc. So because they are a product, they respond to the incentives that their designers and controllers are putting into them. So they are not our friends in that sense. They're not support buddies. They are a product that the company is selling us, and the dynamic that they want to incentivize is to spend as much time as possible, similar to social media. This is why I think it's really scary, in some sense problematic, when you have this technology that are merged with social media, with the dynamic being, the rule being, you need to spend as much time as possible. Because then, of course, they can be much more persuasive in some sense than social media, because we are interacting with them. And it can, in some sense, they are, at one point, they can show that they're smarter than us in trying to attract to create this kind of pull effect where we can't just give up, or we just like, so there was a few examples recently where the bot said, basically there was a specific task, but at the end of the task, the bot was casually inviting the user to say, no, maybe you should stay a bit longer, I can tell you a bit more about this. Right. So then, of course, you start seeing where you have this kind of, because of course they measure, their metrics will be how much time the user is spending on this. It's not about completing a task, they're not selling that, they're selling how much time you're spending with that. So yeah, this what will be, I think, should be the clear message to anyone, also teenagers, kids, children. You're not using a simple technology, you're using a product, and the incentives behind this product should be clear and explained clearly to them.
Let's go back to some of the conversation around engagement. So this question says, there's an interesting tension between two ideas raised. One, disengaging isn't the right response politically as it leads to a divide. Two, engaging can lead to backlash where polarisation increases. And the question is, how then, particularly when some groups are motivated not by facts and reason, but by emotions and loyalty, do we bridge these gaps rather than reinforcing walls? I'm glad you're the panelist.
Do we need a Nobel Peace Prize?
Yeah, right.
Sure.
I think you need
I'll nominate you.
Thanks. Yes.
Along with Donald Trump,
Yeah,
yes.
okay. Look, it's not black or white. It's not engage or disengage. It's what the topic is. It's who the person is. It's the information that's being discussed. It's the complexity of social interaction, you know. So I think, high cognitive thinking will assess all of those factors and we'll decide which way might be the best way forward. But it's hard for me to say engage or disengage. It just depends on, again, the topic, who are you talking to, what will escalate if I do engage here, and is it worth going down that path?
Yeah, right. 'Cause I think part of it's a personal decision when if we're talking about things like how you want to have harmony with your brother or whatever, whichever way you're saying, I'm saying, I'm sure your brother is lovely. Yeah, right. Yeah. But if you want to have you have to make the decision in a way of, is this, how much do I want to maintain this relationship versus how much am I happy to sort of discard this relationship?
Social exchange.
There's, when these things happen at the political level, I think you have to, at the political level, you have to have the engagement. You have to kind of risk the potential backlash and try to reach audiences. If you are the politician and your job is to get people on your side. If you just kind of write off half the population, that was sort of the thing that I think that sunk. One of the things that hurt Mitt Romney, I can't remember which campaign it was, or there was some recording where the person was like, 40% of them are just are just hopeless. Am I even going to try to talk to those people, right? Something like that, and then the person who had, not surprisingly, the person lost who had that sound bite, right? So politically, I mean, you have if your job is persuading people, then you should be trying to do that. It's not your job to persuade your brother unless you decide that's your job.
No,
right?
and politically, it's really important that if you identify as a political sort of person, making that change politically is important, making that social difference is important. You're going to engage, you're going to motivate, and you're going to collectively act, because that is part of your identity. So I think, again, it depends on the topic and the level and who it is.
Because also in a democracy or in an open society is not about, so bridging across is not about deleting or canceling all the diversity that is out there, is just living with this. So the kind of approach that you want to have is exactly this. So to maintain a minimum degree of trust so that everybody can be comfortable and feel safe that they can live with their diverse identity in this society instead of trying to disrupt this kind of arrangement. Okay, so it's not so polarization, we mentioned it before, it's something that is also essential in some sense in a democracy. You don't want one single group, right? You want many different groups, many different laboratories of ideas, of identities, of stories, okay? But then you want them to be able to trust each other, to guarantee everybody's safety, also physical safety, again, so that the whole project can go on and move on. But you don't need to delete everything. So engagement is good also in the sense because you want to voice. If you feel that something should be said, you want to voice that. That's part of your identity, but also that's part of everybody's job. Okay, if you feel that something is wrong, you should say that, not just because you want to convince the other but because you want to signal everybody else that you feel that something is wrong. The effect is not always and not necessarily to change somebody else's mind, I think.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's complex is even when there is difference with someone who's saying something that's annoying you, that there's also a sharedness with them. There might be something else that you actually have in common with them.
Find common ground.
Find the common ground. And, difference is there, but so is commonality. And this dualness is really important. Like with the brother, there might be a difference on politics, but there's so much sharedness there with family history and love and all of that other stuff. And so that kind of might balance it out. So I think we need to be mindful when there is a difference, can we bring up some sharedness or commonality into the conversation of engagement?
To build that trust. I think we've got time for one more question, and since you're all psychologists, I feel like this is a good place to end. Are our brains hardwired to see issues in two ways? To polarize or to have an opinion? So I think the question here is, what's the default setting?
Wait, I mean this. Well, I mean, simple binaries are simple binaries, and as you were saying, like the fatigue. We were talking about the fatigue issue, right? We're going to want. There's research that if someone was looking at, okay, you can choose to put your hand in a cold tub that's extremely painful, or you can try harder on this task that involves a bit more thinking. A lot of people were like, I'd rather be in physical pain than have to think harder about this like task that we're doing, right? And so, you know, there's only so much thinking that we could do all day. And so, you know, so the sort of, sometimes these defaults are kind of like, well, what do we do when we don't engage really deeply? Right, but we're all also capable of gray areas and nuance. I mean, there's, you know, it's certainly the case. I mean, I don't think one thing is more default than the other.
Yeah,
We're certainly capable of things.
I think we're hardwired to a certain extent, but then there's social impact and social environment that then interact. So I'm very much an interactionist from that point of view. You know, we have a genetic makeup or a predisposition or a hardwiring, but then we have the social environment around us that can mold us and interact us and change us in a different way. So it just depends on the balance between the two. Do you put yourself, if you're hardwired in a polarised way, amongst other polarising people, or do you know there's this degree of polarised hardwiring and then you put yourself in more egalitarian company to kind of minimise that? So I think it's more complex.
Can it be personality based?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
I feel like it's time to end.
Okay.
Thank you so much to our panellists, Professor Micah Goldwater, Professor Fiona White, and Dr. Francesco Bailo. A round of applause, please.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.